Good afternoon. My name is Gideon Pogrind. I'm the director of the Gibbs Ethics and Governance think tank. This year, a highly acclaimed book, Reimagining Capitalism, was published. It has great relevance for our times, both globally and locally. It was written by the eminent Harvard University economist, Professor Rebecca Henderson, who is joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Welcome, Rebecca.
Gideon, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Good morning to you. With Rebecca is a prominent and influential South African leader, Dr. Leila Fourie, the CEO of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Welcome, Leila.
Good afternoon, Gideon, and hi to everybody. It's lovely to join and a deep privilege to be in conversation with Rebecca.
We're delighted to host both of you, and let me dive straight into the questions. Rebecca, in your book, you describe a world on fire, a world confronted by three major challenges: environmental degradation, economic inequality, and institutional collapse. Can you broadly reflect on these challenges?
I came to this work via climate change. The first 20 years of my career was spent working with large companies trying to do things differently. And about 15 years ago, energy companies started showing up in my office saying, you know, we think we're going to have to switch to clean energy. And as I started working with them, two things happened. The first was that I became deeply aware of the challenge that climate change faces our world, a truly existential risk that implicates all of us and will hurt the poorest among us first. It's the kind of thing where I wake up regularly at 4 in the morning thinking about, like, what can we do? As I worked on climate change and worked with large companies that were struggling to change, I found myself increasingly interested in what large companies could do about these massive global problems. And I started teaching a course at the Harvard Business School called Reimagining Capitalism, Business and the Big Problems. Well, actually, in the beginning, it was called Open Systems Strategy, and 28 students showed up. But what those 28 students said to me was, Rebecca, it's not just about the climate. You have to talk about inequality and the fact that although we're seeing significant GDP growth worldwide, and in some places like China, they're bringing huge numbers of people out of poverty, in many parts of the world, growth is going to the people at the top. And more people can't see that their children will have even the lives that they have, let alone a better life. And so I said, okay, we're going to do environment and equality. And I started teaching that. And the more I worked on that, the more it became clear to me that yes, there were many things that business could do and should do to address these major problems, but that without a partnership with a democratically accountable, capable government, and without strong support from civil society and a political and social movement which really supports that partnership and that vision of an inclusive capitalism, we weren't going to get anywhere. So then I got into, like, well, what is happening to our institutions? And you know, I'm not telling anyone on this call what they don't know. We have very serious problems. This is the first time in my life I can remember anticipating a democratic election in the United States of America and wondering if we'll have a democracy on the other side. I would never have imagined, even 5 years ago, that we would be in the situation we are. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm very hopeful that we'll have a peaceful democratic transition of power if that's what people vote for. But to be actively worrying that that may not happen, whoa. And this is in the United States. So that's my general reflections, is we are in a very, very tough situation. And again, I know that for those who live in South Africa, this is not news. What strikes me about the current moment is how global it is. As I've been giving talks about this book, I've talked all over the world, Korea, Japan, this is my first talk in Africa, but South America, Northern Europe. We had folks from Russia reaching out who want to buy the rights to the book and publish it in Russian. These issues are front and center everywhere.
Certainly, as you say, that tough situation is not news in South Africa. So interesting how it's been turned into a global conversation. Turning to you, Leila, can you reflect on these challenges from a South African perspective? And would you say that South Africa is engulfed in its own, especially ferocious fire, if I can borrow from Rebecca's phrase?
And it's a very interesting triumvirate that Rebecca puts forward around environmental destruction, inequality, and institutions, and all of them are intimately linked. I personally am very passionate about all of them, and as a mountaineer, what caught my eye is the WWF Living Planet report suggested that on average, we've seen a 2/3 decline in most of our animal population over the last half a century. And I think a lot of that is due to the same environmental destruction, which is contributing to the emergence of these sort of zoonotic diseases such as COVID. If we look at South Africa, food, water, and energy security form the basis of a self-sufficient economy. But as a water-scarce country with very little arable land, dependence on oil imports, South Africa is an economy which is testing the limits of its resource constraints. We will eventually, if it's not kept in check, be unable to support inclusive economic growth. We also have a very large carbon footprint, a mixed dependence on electricity and coal, and tied to this are many jobs. And so a transition away from fossil energy is genuinely very tricky. There are two interesting roadmaps which were published on the energy side, IRP and Eskom, and the objective there is to reduce 11,000 megawatts of coal to be decommissioned and end up in 2030 with a growth in wind-based energy of 48%. If I turn to the economic inequality, unfortunately, South Africa has the dubious honor of having the highest Gini coefficient. And that is largely affected by our unemployment rate. The quarterly labor force is suggesting that in quarter 3 of this year, the unemployment will increase to 37.5%. And we unfortunately have the highest unemployment rate for youth in the world. 58% of our 15 to 24-year-olds are not in a job or education or training. And when you consider that about 1/3 of the South African population is between the age of 18 and 34, you realize that we have an indicting problem looming ahead. The president, in his presidential employment stimulus, announced public investment in human capital and suggesting that the state must be both the creator and the enabler of jobs. And they have created a 100 billion rand investment over the next 3 years to start addressing that. So there is a critical need. Insofar as institutions go, the president raised an interesting point in his economic recovery speech, placing a very firm emphasis on the link between economic transformation and governance reform. And so 10 months after coming into power, Ramaphosa took quite a big step in firing the SARS commissioner, Tom Moyane, in our largest public company called PIC. No fewer than 17 board members and senior executives have left between June of 2018 and April of 2019. And Eskom retrieved 1 billion rand from McKinsey and 150 million rand from Deloitte. And they also cancelled and investigated a number of dubious bonus contracts relating to the Gupta family. So we can go on and on with the number of items that have really indicated that our institutions and our judiciary have been very well tested and have held up well. But it's an important reminder for us that the judicial system is alive and well, and we need to maintain that in South Africa.
Thank you. Can I invite people in the audience to post any questions that they have on the Q&A or the chat? In the meantime, let me carry on with a follow-up question. There are CEOs who would say that business needs to stay in its lane, that it needs to focus on what it knows best. So when you think about some of these huge problems that you've both described, how would you respond to a CEO who might say that they should rather be viewed as externalities, best left to governments and civil society? Can business really rescue a world on fire? Rebecca?
Two thoughts. First, of course, business cannot solve these problems alone. Second, they cannot be solved without business. As I think about business at its best, what does it do? It generates employment and it generates innovation. And the only way out of the kinds of massive problems that we face is both at huge scale. To be frank, I would be more comfortable with a program that generated jobs through the private sector, through appropriately stimulating and supporting firms in competition to generate new jobs, to address problems like the Great Transition. I don't mean for a moment to say this is easy or, hey, let's just get it done. But to transition an entire economy off coal and gas into renewables, that's a huge jobs project. That's a lot of work. And I think, private firms with the right kinds of incentives and the right kinds of regulation are best positioned to lead that charge. And the last thing I would say is, what do you mean you just need to stay in your lane? What are you going to do as the society around you becomes less and less capable of buying the goods you produce or giving you the employees you need? So I think this is the sense of this moment, that we are not just put my head down, don't bother me, I'm just making money. That's not okay anymore. Now, I'm not saying it's easy. My mother was an entrepreneur and I've spent my life working with large organizations. I know how hard it is sometimes just to make payroll. So I'm not saying, business should drop everything and start solving the world's problems. I'm saying we need to rethink about what it means to be a business so that you make the money, you make the payroll, but you are absolutely engaged in a conversation about how do we do that in a way that contributes to the long-term health and security of our society. And as you know, because you've read my book, I think that's eminently possible.
Right. Leila, can I turn to you, and perhaps you can also consider a question that's come through on the Q&A from Lutfia. What is the best way to affect change? Is it through existing structures and traditional corporates, or from without creating new models?
So I think to build on what Rebecca has said, there certainly needs to be a public-private sector collaboration. But what is particularly interesting is that the pandemic has caused, in the current state in which we find ourselves, the pandemic has caused a reversion to basic values. And certainly we are already seeing those basic values reflected in investment flows. So as an economist and a public capital markets person, I look at some of the massive increase that we've seen in investment flows into ESG. BlackRock is suggesting that 88% of their indices that are sustainable did better than their non-sustainable indices. And so I think what we need to see is more opinion leaders in powerful senior positions and more of those who control the flow of investment into sustainable companies. We should never, to repeat the often repeated common saying, we should never waste a good crisis. And this crisis has indicated that sustainable companies are more resilient to shocks in the economy. And on average, we've seen that has been true for us, for the sustainable companies through this cycle. And so I think that we should jump onto that and we should build on that already very powerful trend that we're seeing in the economy and encourage that. There are, of course, critical other structural requirements like a common framework for measuring ESG and an appropriate system that breeds integrity and trust to avoid greenwashing, for example. So there are a number of really important things, but I think that the confidence and building on the current cycle of growth and value that the sustainable sector is producing is primary and most important.
Right. Can I just ask you again, Leila, you spoke about the ESG metrics, and Rebecca's book speaks about the need to rewire traditional finance. I think, Rebecca, that's the phrase that you use, as being a critical way to reimagine capitalism. ESG metrics, as you've noted, Leila, are an important response to this need. Is ESG reporting actually changing the way that businesses make decisions? And to what extent are ESG metrics altering investor behavior? And perhaps in your response, you can also reflect on your role as the co-chair of the GISD, the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Forum, which is made up of 30 leading CEOs from around the world. It'd be interesting to hear about some of your perspectives and insights in that position.
Mm-hmm. Mm. So I would say the single most important thing in embedding sustainable companies is a common metric and common framework that is globally and universally accepted. After the crash the great crash in October 1929, the government intervened and in the US, and out of that, which took 10 years, of course, became the GARP standards, generally accepted accounting practices. And it's my belief that out of this crisis will come a globally, universally accepted sustainable development measurement technique. Insofar as the flows and how we're seeing an interest in that space, global flows, according to Morningstar, in 2020 were up 72%. And over the last 15 years, over $30 trillion worth of assets have been invested into the sustainable development space. So what is critically needed is to ensure that those massive flows are in fact finding their way into what should be genuinely and on an equally measured basis a sustainable company. Now, South Africa, and I hold the co-chair, is represented on the United Nations GISD Forum. We recently created a common definition for sustainable development, and we are now in the process of collaborating and using our global convening power through all of the international agencies to try to forge a universal framework and standard according to which sustainable development should be measured, so that you have equal measurement across industries and equal measurement across countries. This is particularly important for those multinationals who tend to operate across many different countries. And so we're very excited about that. thinking about how long it took to get the GARP in place, which was more than 10 years, I have no doubt that this will be an iterative and slowly evolving embryonic sort of process.
Right. Rebecca, perhaps you could reflect on the ESG metrics and also relate to a question I see on the chat from one of my colleagues, Anthony Prangley. Can Rebecca address what she thinks is the core leadership strategy challenge of both making money and playing a transformational role in sustainability issues?
For sure. And that plays into another question I see in the chat from Brett Stengo, who says, well, if it's so easy to make money and do good, why isn't everyone doing it? The profit margin, the profit motive alone would get us there. And I think these two questions are intimately related, which is, yes, I do believe it's possible to make a difference against these large problems and make money, but I am not suggesting for a moment that it is easy or cheap. Or like you walk in on Monday morning and you're like, whoa, I saw this great talk and we just have to, do things differently. This is tough. This is tough work. It's tough for a couple of reasons. So leadership skills, first, strategic vision. Where are the sweet spots where indeed you can increase employment or create better quality jobs or address the problems of the energy transition and make money? And that's often not an easy thing to do. I was the Eastman Kodak Professor of Management for the first 20 years of my career. I know, and those of you who don't know, Kodak made more money than anyone in the entire world, exaggeration. Digital came along, did they react? They did not. So it's very tough to think about managing your business in new ways, but that's the first leadership skill, is the world is changing, how do I respond? And it's so easy to just focus on business as usual and keeping the organization ticking over. And I'll get to that other stuff tomorrow. So that's the first set of leadership skills. And that's the first reason we don't see everyone moving in this direction, is it takes courage, it takes vision. And to put my strategy hat on for a bit, it takes a little resources and a little time. What are we going to do differently? How do we think about this? Just like any major change process, you've got to invest in that change process. What's the second issue? The second issue is that, whoa, new business models are tough. And, many people are like, what are they doing? And how is this shifting? And this is nice talk from the top, but I don't see any real difference. I don't see any difference in my own work. So building what I call a high road employment system, a big phrase for making sure that everyone in the firm shares the mission and understands where you're trying to go and believes you mean it, and that your incentives are aligned with operating in these new kinds of ways, that you're treating everyone in the firm with dignity and respect, with a living wage and the opportunity to use their own skills. So many firms, maybe not in South Africa, okay, I know, I do not know. But in the US, so many firms are still run as if people were cogs in a machine. And it was all about just getting them to make their quarterly numbers. And we know from years of research, we really do know this, that giving people more power and empowerment, if they have a clear sense of the mission of the firm, and if they're aligned, and if the incentives are in line, significantly increases creativity and innovation. We know that's true. But we also know that getting there requires commitment and investment and showing that you walk the talk. So leadership skill, empathy, emotional engagement, organizational design, the ability to admit you're wrong. One of the things that these high-performing companies share is, and this, you see this, is a meeting every morning or every week or every month where the senior team gets together and says, okay, what's not working? What's not happening? And the ability to have those real conversations and move the resources to where they're needed, that's super tough. So it's not as if I'm saying, oh yeah, just let's do it. This is a fundamental transformation in how we think about running firms and what their purpose is. And the reason to do it, to go to the question from an anonymous attendee, is not because, oh yeah, I suddenly saw the light. It's because the alternatives are much worse. We kid ourselves that if we do nothing, nothing will change. But that is not true. I worked with Kodak as they lost that business. I spent 6 months in Finland trying to persuade Nokia, once the world's largest cell phone manufacturer, that Apple was a genuine threat. And I could not do it. Life was too comfortable. You know, why go through all that thing of change? I don't want to do it. So this is all about understanding this is urgent. We must change. We must begin the hard work, but it's hard work. It's not instantaneous. And I sound like I'm calling for heroes. Like, how many CEOs are there like this? There are a few, but really this is a team effort. No single individual can carry this kind of transition and carry all these skills, but a team together can. And a team supported by colleagues and peers at other firms who are also trying to make the same transition. Because Leela, I loved your talking about what's happening in investment and the flows going into sustainably managed companies. I think the thing I would add to that is this needs to be collaborative. That is, that industry by industry, region by region, we have to agree that there's some things we all have to do. That there are some things, some ways of behaving that are not acceptable. So forgive me, Gideon, I'm ranting, but this is like a big deal, but it can be done. That's the exciting and interesting thing. It can be done.
Right. We're exploring more how it can be done. Another way to rewire finances, as you discuss in your book, is to reduce investor power, protecting managers from the kind of relentless pressures and short-term expectations of capital markets. Leila, can I turn to you? What corporate governance changes might help to achieve this? I see Nishi has related to the question around investors, saying, I often wonder what investors are actually looking at and where to invest. What type of indicators should leaders be looking at that move the needle in terms of sustainability? So perhaps you could factor in that as well. And finally, if you'll excuse me for this mouthful, a question which I know is particularly pertinent to you, in regards to encouraging a more long-term approach to corporate decision-making, what are the advantages and disadvantages of listings? I know there are a bunch of questions in that, but relating to investing as a way of reimagining capitalism. Leila.
And I think I come back to this point that I was making earlier, Gideon, around the growth, the tremendous vertical growth that we've seen by investors putting funds into sustainable investment companies. And I think in a large part, this is starting to dispel the perception of a financial trade-off that either investors or indeed CEOs have to make in investing in sustainable long-term businesses. As I said earlier, we are building a global framework to start to measure in a more consistent way. I think what is required on the softer side is brave and steadfast leaders. And we saw Paul Polman from Unilever, who took a very far-reaching decision just after he was appointed in 2009 to stop reporting quarterly. And that was really explicitly designed to focus on the long-term financial performance. So I do think that that's a really critical component. I think other points there are that investors or companies typically are very good at externalizing costs and internalizing profits. And the financial components relating to both the E, the S, and the G can be financially very material. If we take the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, that happened when the BP oil rig exploded. More than 4.9 million barrels of oil emptied straight into the Gulf of Mexico over a period of about 87 days. And the economy suffered too. So it wasn't only that there was deep sea ecosystems that were changed. So what you are seeing naturally happen, which isn't necessarily requiring intervention, is that events such as those are receiving the publicity that's required. Customers are now starting to vote with their feet. Millennials who are working for companies are choosing to work for companies with whom they share a congruent value system. And so there are many, it's a confluence of many different events. Insofar as what we are doing from a pure disclosure perspective at the JSE, we have announced a number of changes over the years. We've been on the forefront in introducing, for example, King reporting, which defines which explicitly requires companies to disclose their gender and general equality stats at a board level. We are also in the midst of introducing new products that enable funding to be funneled into projects for good, such as our new sustainable development bonds, our new social bonds, and our green bonds, which have already been between 3 and 4 times oversubscribed. So I think a combination of product development, of strong governance and disclosure requirements, which are done in collaboration with global bodies, together with the very clear flows that are already starting to emerge and to reflect as they're coming out of the crisis, are the sort of 3 building blocks that will be critical to move us forward and to ensure a consistent coverage of the ESG achievements by companies.
Rebecca, I see a very interesting question on the chat from Al May, who is at Nottingham Business School. You stress the importance of measurement tools to assess the impact of responsible investment, but impact is a complex phenomenon that resists being captured in simplistic metrics. Is one standard really the solution? Perhaps you can respond to that, and Leila, if you could also give a response.
As Leila suggested, modern financial accounting essentially has its roots in the crash of 1929. And it took 10 years to get a rough framework in place. I would suggest it took 50 to get our current framework in place. So even just looking at financial measures, creating a common standard is tricky. So in the case of ESG, we face a conundrum. On the one hand, we want ESG reporting and we want it now. On the other, we're very much aware that many of the measures we have are not that great. So I think what we're looking at is a process of iteration. For example, my colleague, George Seraphim here at Harvard with me, is one of the founders of the Institute for Impact Weighted Accounts. And he would be the first to say measuring impact is really hard, but they went ahead and tried. And their first measurements are up on their website, freely available. Environmental impacts caused by 1,800 of the world's largest firms. What do they find? First pass, certainly lots to quarrel with, but for 1/3 of the firms in their database, the environmental costs of their operations are greater than their total profits. I mean, whoa. You know, you can have error bars on the measurement and still be like, whoa. And similarly, as we begin to develop really good measures around social impact, around the costs of continuing to exclude people of color, which is a huge issue in the US and of course, an issue in many other societies worldwide, they're not perfect. But what we need to do is get that wheel of change turning. Because yes, you have imperfect measures, current ESG, all kinds of problems. Let's try the next iteration. Let's try the next iteration. And it will be tough for firms, absolutely. What do I report against? my standard advice to most firms, Leila, I'd be super curious what you say on this, is, go for the metrics that are material to you, that really talk about your business and that will help you manage your own business better. Those are the ones you really need to understand and focus on. And if you think they're the wrong metrics, tell us why, and tell your investors why, and report other things if that's what you think will give investors a better picture of how you're operating. But the core realization is non-financial measures of performance are material. They're material to the firm and they're material to the society, and we must begin to get a grip on them.
How, Leila, would you respond to that?
Yes,
go for the metrics that are material to you.
I completely concur with Rebecca's perspectives. What I would add to that, or contribute to that, is I think it's bigger than just the company. What's important to that specific company? Context matters. Country dynamics matter, and the economic cycle, either globally or within that country, matters. And what was important to us pre the pandemic may fundamentally, profoundly change. In South Africa, the dynamics at play are people are about trying to build an inclusive society, education, addressing our unemployment crisis, ensuring that we have an equal and representative workforce. And so those measures would be critically important in a South African context, perhaps less so in a more developed world. And so I think impact investing, if we look at our bond framework, we measure inputs at this point, our social bonds, etc. So the issuance of those bonds require that you come back and report on an annual basis on how those funds are being used, which should be exactly the same for every other asset class. Now, in order to, if you're measuring, did we build 100 schools or 30 toilets in a rural area, the real impact that we're wanting to measure is, were we able to educate X number of students in maths and science, which are critical skills shortages in the South African context? Were we able to get that funnel of students starting in first year education increasing in the number that have university access, for example? So identifying and measuring those impacts rather than the inputs, which are contextually and culturally and societally relevant to your country or your region, are of vital importance. And I would hesitate to say that we should have a national agenda on the ESG as to which of those elements are most crucial. Are we talking about power generation and water because of the compounding effect on the economy? Are we talking about education, etc.? And ensure that those are all reflected in governance standards and in reporting standards. And it's not just for publicly listed companies, it's equally so for private equity and private companies.
Gideon, can I tell a story?
Yes, of course.
Leila reminded me of one of my favorite examples of a company grappling with some of these problems and making money at the same time. It's about a company called Southwire, which is a $5 billion company located in rural Georgia. And Southwire discovered it had a serious problem. It had a double problem. It could not find the people it needed to staff its factories, and the community in which it was embedded was, to be polite, going to hell. And more children were not graduating from high school. And not graduating from high school in rural Georgia was to set yourself up for a really bad life. And as they dug into this problem, they found that kids were sleeping in cars, that they had to leave home because their parents were abusive. And these were kids who were, barely managing it to hold it together. And they weren't graduating high school because they had to go to work. They had to make money. They had to take care of younger siblings. There was no way. And so the CEO of Southwire announced that he was going to start hiring these kids. And he was going to hire them before they graduated from high school. And he was going to build a dedicated facility where they could have a job in the morning and go to school in the afternoon. And I mean, maybe it's different, but at Southwire, his colleagues were like, "You're going to do what?" And he said, "We'll start small, we'll start small, we'll try it, we'll partner with the school system, but let's try this." And because I'm telling you this story, that it ended really well. That when the students had a cash income from working on the production line in the morning, that they didn't have to, they had more brain space, they didn't have to take another job. They could work in the afternoon on their high school material, and that they learn all kinds of skills that those of us who are privileged take for granted. Working as part of a team, showing up on a regular basis, what it means to do statistical process control, because it's much more fun to study math and science when you're trying to do statistical process control on the line in the morning. So they were motivated to learn, and that program was a huge success. They ended up hiring many of the graduates of that program, and something like 2/3 of those students not only all of them graduated high school, but went on to higher education. And the CEO said, "Okay, this is fantastic. Let's do this across the United States." Super tough. Who's going to pay for persuading other companies that there actually is a business model here? Who's going to hold their hand as they learn the nuances of actually implementing this? Who's going to talk to the people at Southwire about how they came to really value these students and how they came to mentor them personally and how it helped improve the whole climate at Southwire because they had such a clear sense of what they were accomplishing? It's out there. Now, he, of course, set up a foundation, is trying to invest, is persuading local states and governments to work with firms to roll out this program. But I hope there are two things from this story. One, it's absolutely possible. Two, it does require energy and tension. And three, scaling at scale is going to require government partnership, for sure.
That's a wonderful story.
You up Southwire. Here it is, 12 for Life. That's the name of the program. They are super excited about it. It's been adopted across a wide variety of firms and other organizations across Georgia and across a number of other states. But they are so proud of it, and it made so much difference. And absolutely, it was profitable.
It's a very inspiring story. You spoke earlier, Rebecca, about how business can't do it all by itself in the face of these very formidable problems. And there's certainly things that business can do by itself. This is a wonderful example, but there also are very important ways in which business needs to cooperate with government and civil society to achieve collective impact. Perhaps you can talk about that, and perhaps you can share another story that illustrates the possibilities of that kind of cooperation.
Sure. And here, telling the story makes it sound easy, but it takes time to build. So one of the stories I know a little bit about is based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is for all kinds of reasons a tough place to talk about because it's not a perfect place. But it is a place where the leaders of the companies based in Minneapolis have for a long time believed that they have a shared interest in the success and progress of their city. Colloquially, they say, there's not many natural advantages. We're in the middle of nowhere and the weather is terrible. So the only way we're going to persuade people to stay here and attract new people to come is if it's a fantastic place to live and work. And so one of the programs they decided to invest in was early childhood education. The research is very clear that children who don't get the support and nurturing they need at an early stage are basically, wow, I want to use a strong word, but the rest of their lives not so great. And And if you can get children 3, 4, 5, good quality early childhood education makes all the difference. They couldn't afford to completely redo the early childhood situation in Minneapolis, like far too expensive. What they could do is pay for experiments. They could pay to explore whether rating daycare providers was a success, that you could really rate daycare providers. You could tell parents, no, you should be sending your children here, not there. They could develop a scale to do that. They could explore giving scholarships to parents to put their children in daycare, as so that, and see if that worked, see if parents were willing to take it, see what the payback on those kinds of programs were. So they paid for the experiments, and the experiments paid off big time. The research suggested that many more children were getting into much higher quality early childhood education, and the payback to the state as a whole of having children who are better integrated, have those early skills that we all take for granted, but should not be taken for granted. Basic reading, basic literacy, basic ability to deal with children and other children and be good in groups, pays off big time. So that's an example that I point to. Now, massive problems of racial exclusion in Minneapolis that I know the business community is tightly engaged on. But one of the things that's interesting about Minneapolis is they chivvy each other into participating. So it's a social connection as well as rationally, I should do this because it will make Minnesota a better place. They're persuading each other to raise the floor for every company in Minneapolis. So it's both a social connection as well as just a, well, this is the right thing for my business. Leila, I don't want to put Leila on the spot, but my sense is that this kind of group activity is like, okay, we need to do this. Let's do it. Let's move together is a really important part of what needs to happen.
Leila?
Yep, I completely concur. And in fact, in South Africa, what I've seen, particularly post the crisis, is a genuine bottom-up building of society. What has shifted for me in my entire sort of 30-plus year career in looking at how public and private sector work together to rebuild society is that for the first time, private sector are genuinely leaning in and willing to do what it takes. We do have a lot of regulation and infrastructure in place. For example, we have broad-based Black economic empowerment requirements that companies have a points system, and it is genuinely broad-based. It's not just about hiring in the right sort of race mix, but also about building up smaller companies that need to contribute to the broader economic growth. Our pension funds Reg 28 Act requires that investors consider ESG considerations in their portfolio. I've actually just come back from a weekend with a number of a cycling event called Change Your Life with a number of prominent CEOs who have contributed to very uplifting centers that look after underprivileged children and give them opportunities both in learning and in their sporting environments. And these things all have a compounding effect because it's not just about that one individual that's given an opportunity, but it's about how that affects their extended families, how they're able to build houses, develop technologies and develop and establish themselves in their asset base within their communities, and therefore increasing the consumption in the economy and building the broader economy. And so we have a lot of need in our country, but with that need comes tremendous opportunity. And I think if we can take one thing out of the terrible complexities and difficulties of the pandemic, in a post-COVID world, it would be that we absolutely have to collaborate and we have to build this economy from the bottom up. This is not government's problem. This is not somebody else's problem. It's a joint problem for which we're equally all responsible.
I see a question from Professor Molly Painter on the chat. Thanks for underscoring the importance of contextual priorities in measuring impact. But perhaps a related problem is the translation of social value into financial value. The business case does not always materialize soon enough to sustain the argument for investment. And is it really true that all meaningful investments, quote unquote, pay in financial terms? It's wonderful that the Southwire story has a happy ending, but what happens when there isn't such a happy ending or such a happy financial ending? What would you say to that, Rebecca and
Oh, Professor Painter, for sure. So here's the image I have. Leading edge firms like Southwire raise the ceiling. It becomes clear that if those kinds of actions have to happen en masse, or other actions that clearly everybody should do but don't pay off, that we need to raise the floor. We need regulatory action. So for example, here in the US, do I think for a moment that purpose-driven firms can address our problems of inequality and racial exclusion? Absolutely not. I think we need minimum wage legislation, we need educational reform, we need workplace regulation of all kinds. But here's the thing. As firms start to move out in this direction, it becomes clear how important the regulation is, and you increase the possibility of a coalition of firms going to government and saying, we need this. I mean, the most obvious example right now is in climate, and I see a question in the chat about should corporate South Africa go and say, look, we've got to get off dirty energy. I don't know the South African case, but I can say that in the US and Europe, groups of corporate leaders going into state and mayoral offices and saying, we got to get this region clean. This is not okay. How can we help? We must have carbon regulation is a huge part of the answer. So this is not just about firms doing the right thing. It's always profitable. Clearly, there are many right things that are not profitable, but that everyone should do. And that's what governments ideally are good at doing. This is why, this is so easy to say, and I know how hard it is to do, but a collaboration between business and government that is transparent, that is open to civil society, that is not corrupt, that is clearly focused on the mutual good, that's what we need. And it's possible. It's happened before, usually in times of massive national emergency, but I'm sort of on the edge of thinking we have that, got that one. Let's get going with the collaboration.
Leila?
I don't think I could have put it more eloquently than Rebecca. Just to maybe reiterate, I'd say we need three key things. We do need government intervention. We need a receptive, open, transparent, and educating media to educate consumers, to educate employees about the effects of whatever actions it might be, whether it leads to inequality, whether it leads to environmental degradation, or whether it challenges our institutions. And thirdly, we need a coalition of the willing in corporate South Africa, in our context, in corporate global, to band together and to come up with genuine and well thought out research and rationale to address things like coal companies funding political parties, to address dirty companies who are funding the success of politicians. And without that, I think we will continue to degrade. There is a voice being found, particularly in the millennial environment, but business needs to use its convening power. It needs to use its deep pockets to do the research and to proactively come forward with those, with the suggestions around how we need to tackle all of these E, S, and G problems.
Rebecca, many of us from around the world have, as you well know, been closely following the US elections. I have to confess that I check the latest opinion polls a couple of times every day. In your book, you speak about the need for inclusive political institutions, and you warn against the dangers of populism and demagoguery. Briefly, how might business think about its responsibilities in terms of supporting democracy?
I believe that the long-term health of our economy rests on democratically accountable, capable, broadly legitimate government and a strong civil society. And Leila is completely right. That means a media that tells the truth and deals with the real issues, as well as an independent judiciary. And that business has both a moral duty to contribute to the strength of democratic institutions. We say that free markets bring prosperity and freedom, but only if the rules of the game are right. And you need a real democracy to make sure the rules of the game are there. So I think business has a strong moral and economic case to invest in civics, basic civics, making sure that everyone can vote, making sure the system is not awash in money. My number one ask of US corporate leaders is to support the repeal of Citizens United and the active reduction of corporate money in politics. The fact that the fossil fuel companies in the US have spent hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to deny the reality of climate change and corrupt our politics is an outrage and nothing to do with free enterprise. So I think it's centrally important. I mean, right now, we have thousands of companies giving their employees time off to vote. I think business should speak out against gerrymandering and voter suppression. It should be a real democracy. And I absolutely believe that's in business's long-term interest. In the short term, it's tempting to say, oh, it's fine. I love the lower taxes and the less regulation. I'm going to put my head down and make a ton of money. It is totally destructive in the long term. We're caught in a prisoner's dilemma. Everyone has incentive to subvert the democracy to get the rule that they want, but in the long run, we lose the whole game. Sorry for the speech, but all of us are on edge here. This is a very, very tricky time in US history.
We're almost out of time, unfortunately, and unfortunately because this has been just a wonderful discussion laced with so many valuable insights. And I see on the chat and the Q&A so many important and interesting questions, which unfortunately we haven't been able to do justice to. If I can just invite you, Leila and Rebecca, to offer quick closing comment. At the beginning of your book, Rebecca, you describe a question that you grappled with for a number of years, whether only exceptional individuals could master the creation of both purpose and profit. And you, both of you, during the course of this discussion, have in different ways addressed that question. But just as a quick closing thought, any suggestions on how we might make attempts to build a profitable, equitable, and sustainable capitalism more part of the corporate mainstream? Leila?
So thank you, Gideon. And I'd say that there has been a systemic shift in an understanding that all of the components in our environment are interconnected. And we should use the lessons of the pandemic to start to address all of these issues, i.e., public-private partnership is vital, not only to restart the economy, but to address our sustainability challenges. We need to leverage the rapid uptake of technology that the pandemic has begun to build a more inclusive environment, make sure that our townships in South Africa have free Wi-Fi so the children who are learning from home and working from home are able to make a living and to grow and develop. And we need to have a consistent and globally universal measurement scorecard, so that we can accurately compare sustainable development. But I think most importantly, we need hearts and minds. We need an emotional and a cultural commitment, and we need a transformation of leaders' mental frame and mental perspective that they take on shareholder value creation and general problems of the world.
Right. Rebecca?
I would add to that, it's not just leaders. It needs to happen everywhere. And it's easier in many ways for it to happen in everyday parts of the corporation. We make it sound as though thinking about both purpose and profit was an unnatural act, but it's not. It's unnatural to think that the only goal is to make as much money as possible and devil to the rest of the society. That's like a weird thought. Most people think the idea that, yeah, we should make a decent living, but really make a difference to the world around us, to many people that seems completely normal. We've suppressed it. We need, wherever we are, wherever we stand, to begin to look around and say, how can I do that? How can I do both purpose and profit? Leila, you talked about Paul Polman, who is an amazing man. But one of the reasons he could transform Unilever is he drew on the work of hundreds of people inside Unilever who had already shown that it was possible to make a difference and make money at the same time. First in small ways and then in larger. But yes, it's we need an avalanche, and all of us are pebbles. And pebbles are what drives an avalanche. So I think wherever we are, whatever we do, we can begin to drive this transformation.
Right. And you speak, Rebecca, in your book about what you call a secret weapon for people who have purpose and profit, or who put purpose beyond profits.
Yes.
Because people who believe their work has meaning beyond themselves can, of course, achieve amazing things. And I think that that's a really important thing to think about.
In 20 years of studying transformation, the consistent result was that those firms who were purpose-driven were much, much more likely to be able to make the transition. This is our secret weapon, that we can see the world is burning, and we want to help.
So in using that secret weapon and in thinking about this discussion, I'm reminded of a basic distinction that I've mentioned elsewhere. It's a distinction between optimism and hope. Optimism is the belief that things will get better, whereas hope is the belief that we can make things better. Whereas optimism is passive, hope is active. And you need courage to sustain hope. You don't need courage to be optimistic, but you need courage to have hope. Reimagining capitalism, I think, is clear, is the only alternative to a world on fire. Reimagining capitalism requires courage and
Did we just lose Gideon?
I think we did. I thought it was my Wi-Fi.
That was such a great way to end.
Gideon, you're back.
Yes.
Sorry,
We lost you for a moment.
Eloquent.
Oh, well, thank you for so many eloquent points. So wonderful insights, both of you. I thought it was a great discussion, and could have just gone on and on. And I'm sure as we were talking, you got to scan the chat and the Q&A, and you could see how responsive the attendees were. And I've got no doubt that this discussion will be disseminated far and wide.
Leila, may I say what a great pleasure it was to do this conversation together. I really appreciated your perspectives and my goodness, your deep, deep engagement in these issues. I just study this. You're actually doing it. So thank you very much for all you're doing.
Well, thank you so much. That's just overwhelmingly kind. And as I said before we started, I started your book a week ago and couldn't put it down. It's eloquent and beautifully written, coherent and very cogent. And it's certainly made me think about the importance of starting to act now. So it's been a deep pleasure to chat to you and to hear your very inspiring insights, and Gideon, to you for your thoughtful questions. And thank you to the audience for tremendous engagement in the Q&A. I wish we had 3 hours to discuss, and a long bottle of wine to chat about all of those interesting questions. It's far easier to give an answer than it is to think of a profound and insightful question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gideon, thank you very much.
Thank you. Look forward to meeting you in Boston one day.
Oh, yes, please. In person one day. Yes, indeed.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Best. Bye, Rebecca.
Thank
Bye,
you,
Leila.
Bye-bye. Bye, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you.